Give me the gun. The words cut through the chaos of the checkpoint like a knife through canvas. For a brief second, every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every Navy SEAL standing behind the reinforced gate stared at the woman who had just spoken. Emily Carter stood there in a stained kitchen apron, flour dust still clinging to one sleeve, her blonde hair tucked beneath a military cap. Nothing about her appearance suggested urgency. Nothing about her suggested combat. And yet there was something in her voice that made even the most experienced operators pause. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows across the forward operating base. A convoy was overdue. Radios crackled with fragmented reports. Tension spread across the compound like a storm rolling over open water. Commander Ryan Walker stood near the gate studying a map when he heard the voice. He turned and found himself looking at the base cook. Emily rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. She arrived before dawn every day, prepared breakfast for nearly 200 personnel, and disappeared back into the kitchen long before most soldiers noticed she was there. To the men around her, she was simply the cook. The woman who handed out eggs, coffee, and trays of mashed potatoes. Nothing more. A young SEAL laughed. "You want the gun?" Several others exchanged amused looks. One shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Emily ignored them. Her eyes remained fixed on the ridgeline beyond the gate. The mountains stretched for miles, their jagged outlines fading into the evening haze. Ryan noticed something strange. She wasn't looking randomly. She was studying the terrain, measuring it somehow, tracking details nobody else seemed to notice. The commander stepped closer. "What did you say?" Emily never looked away from the horizon. "I said give me the rifle." The laughter disappeared. Her tone wasn't emotional. It wasn't desperate. It sounded more like someone asking for a wrench in a repair shop. Calm. Certain. Ryan folded his arms. "And why exactly would I do that?" For the first time, Emily glanced toward him. Her blue eyes were steady, not nervous, not intimidated, just focused. "Because you're all watching the wrong ridge." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Several operators immediately turned back toward the mountains. Ryan felt a small knot tighten in his chest. Most civilians wouldn't even know what ridge they were monitoring. Most support personnel avoided tactical discussions altogether. Yet Emily spoke as if she had been part of the briefing. A gust of desert wind swept through the checkpoint. Dust drifted across the concrete barriers. Somewhere behind them, a radio operator called out another update. The convoy still hadn't arrived. Ryan looked back toward Emily. The apron, the kitchen boots, the woman everyone overlooked. None of it matched the confidence standing in front of him. And for reasons he couldn't explain, the commander suddenly found himself wondering if the quiet cook from the mess hall had been hiding something all along. 12 hours earlier, the base had been running on routine and caffeine. The sun had not yet cleared the mountains when Emily Carter unlocked the kitchen doors and stepped into the mess hall, carrying 2 crates of supplies. The air smelled of coffee, fresh bread, and industrial disinfectant. Most people never noticed how early she arrived. By the time the first soldiers wandered in for breakfast, the food was already hot and waiting. That was how Emily preferred it. Quiet work. No attention. No questions. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, checking ovens, reviewing inventory sheets, and coordinating with the supply clerk. Outside, trucks rolled across the compound while helicopters passed overhead on their way to distant assignments. Another ordinary morning at a remote military base. At least that was what everyone believed. By 6:30, the mess hall was packed with operators, mechanics, communication specialists, and support personnel. Conversations bounced off the walls. Laughter mixed with the sound of trays and coffee mugs. Emily stood behind the serving counter filling plates without saying much. Most people barely looked at her. To them, she was simply part of the background, as familiar as the tables and chairs. A young SEAL named Tyler Brooks accepted his breakfast tray and grinned at the operator beside him. "Best thing about this deployment is that the kitchen never misses." His friend laughed. "That is because Carter probably cares more about pancakes than we care about missions." Several nearby operators chuckled. Emily heard every word. She simply continued serving food. Tyler pointed toward a television mounted in the corner. A military news segment was showing footage from a training range. Long-range shooters were competing against targets hundreds of yards away. "Now that looks fun," Tyler said. Can you imagine giving a rifle to somebody from the kitchen? More laughter followed. She would probably season the scope before using it. Another operator joked. The group found that particularly amusing. Emily slid another tray across the counter without reacting. One of the older mechanics shook his head. Leave her alone. She works harder than half of you. Tyler shrugged. I'm just saying. Everybody has their lane. Emily finally looked up. Her expression remained calm. That is usually true. Tyler smiled, thinking he had won the exchange. But something about her answer lingered in the air. She did not sound offended. She sounded certain. The morning continued. Breakfast ended. Tables emptied. Most personnel returned to their duties. Commander Ryan Walker entered the mess hall shortly before 8 o'clock. He was reviewing reports while drinking black coffee. As he passed through the kitchen entrance, he noticed Emily studying a weather chart taped beside a supply board. Wind speeds, temperature shifts, visibility forecasts. It was an unusual thing for a cook to examine. Ryan paused. Planning a picnic? He asked. Emily glanced at him and offered a faint smile. Just paying attention to the weather, sir. Ryan nodded and continued walking. Yet something about the exchange stayed with him throughout the day. Hours later, when alarms began sounding across the base and uncertainty spread through every radio channel, he would remember that weather chart. And he would remember the quiet woman who seemed to notice details that everyone else ignored. The first signs of trouble appeared shortly after noon. The operations center received an unexpected transmission, then another, each carrying fragments of information that did not quite fit together. Vehicles that should have checked in were running behind schedule. Weather conditions along the mountain routes were changing faster than expected. Communications became inconsistent. Nothing alarming on its own, but enough to put experienced personnel on edge. Commander Ryan Walker spent most of the afternoon moving between briefings and radio stations. Years of experience had taught him that major problems rarely announced themselves all at once. They arrived in small pieces, hidden inside ordinary details. Outside, the base continued functioning as usual. Mechanics serviced equipment. Communications specialists monitored frequencies. Security teams rotated through checkpoints. In the kitchen, Emily Carter prepared the evening meal. Large trays of food lined the counters while industrial ovens hummed steadily in the background. To anyone watching, she appeared completely focused on her duties. Yet every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the small window above the sink. Beyond it, the mountain stood silent beneath a pale sky. One of the younger kitchen assistants noticed. You keep looking out there like you are expecting something. Emily continued slicing vegetables. Just watching the weather. The assistant laughed. Looks the same as always to me. Emily did not answer. A few minutes later, she stepped outside carrying a supply clipboard. The afternoon wind brushed across the compound. Most people barely noticed it. Emily did. She paused beside a storage building and watched a trail of dust move across the ground. The direction was different from that morning. Subtle, easy to miss. Her gaze shifted toward the distant ridgelines. Then she quietly returned inside. Meanwhile, several SEAL operators gathered near the motor pool waiting for updates. Tyler Brooks was among them. The earlier jokes from breakfast had evolved into an ongoing source of entertainment. Maybe the kitchen crew can solve our communications issues, he joked. A few operators laughed. Another added, if things get really bad, we can deploy mashed potatoes as a tactical asset. More laughter followed. Ryan happened to overhear the conversation as he walked past. Normally, he would have ignored it. But for some reason he found himself asking, what exactly has Carter ever done to you? The group exchanged surprised looks. Tyler shrugged. Nothing, sir. Just having fun. Ryan nodded and continued walking. Yet he found the answer strangely unsatisfying. The truth was that nobody knew much about Emily Carter. She had arrived at the base months earlier. Her personnel file was ordinary. Her evaluations were excellent. Her record contained no disciplinary issues, no dramatic achievements, no remarkable stories, just consistency, reliability, quiet competence, the kind of person people overlooked because she never demanded attention. As evening approached, the atmosphere across the compound changed. Radios became busier. Security personnel moved with greater urgency. Conversations grew shorter. The convoy was now significantly overdue. Ryan stood outside the operations center studying incoming reports when he noticed Emily again. She was standing near the mess hall entrance, looking toward the western mountains. Not worried. not confused. Watching, almost as if she knew something everyone else had yet to understand. The update everyone had been waiting for finally arrived just after sunset. A radio operator stepped away from his console and hurried across the operations center, carrying a fresh report. Commander Ryan Walker read the page once, then again. The convoy had encountered an unexpected delay along a mountain route nearly 18 miles from the base. Vehicle movement had slowed to a crawl. Communication quality continued to deteriorate. Visibility was dropping as dust moved through several valleys. None of the information sounded catastrophic, yet every experienced operator in the room sensed the same thing. Something was wrong. Ryan immediately ordered additional monitoring and redirected several personnel toward the main gate. Outside, security teams adjusted positions while radio traffic increased. The atmosphere across the compound shifted from routine caution to focused readiness. Conversations became shorter. Smiles disappeared. Even the younger operators who normally joked through every situation grew quiet. Near the mess hall, Emily Carter watched the activity without saying a word. She carried a box of kitchen supplies toward a storage room when she noticed several soldiers gathering near the perimeter. Their attention remained fixed on the western ridgeline. Emily stopped walking. The wind had strengthened again. Dust moved differently now, flowing through low terrain features before curling upward along the slopes. Most people would have seen nothing unusual. Emily studied it for several seconds. Then she slowly continued toward the kitchen. Inside, dinner service was nearly complete. Trays emptied quickly as personnel grabbed meals between assignments. The noise level remained high, but an undercurrent of tension could now be felt beneath every conversation. Tyler Brooks entered with 2 other SEALs and collected his food. As he passed Emily, he offered another grin. Looks like tonight might get interesting. Emily continued wiping down a counter. Interesting usually means someone missed something earlier. Tyler laughed. You sound like intelligence staff now. No, Emily replied calmly. Intelligence staff gets paid to notice things. For a moment, Tyler looked uncertain whether she was joking. Before he could answer, a radio mounted near the serving area crackled with another transmission. Several soldiers immediately turned toward the sound. The message was brief but urgent enough to draw attention. Tyler's expression changed. He set down his tray and headed for the exit. Within minutes, the mess hall began emptying. Personnel moved toward assigned positions throughout the compound. Emily watched them go. Then she removed her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it beside a stack of supply forms. One of the kitchen assistants looked confused. Are we shutting down early? Emily glanced toward the window overlooking the mountains. Probably for a while. Outside, Commander Walker stood near the gate reviewing updates with his team leaders. The convoy was still, attempting to reach the base. Progress remained slow. Communication remained inconsistent. The ridgelines beyond the perimeter had become dark silhouettes against the fading sky. Ryan looked up and noticed movement near the mess hall. Emily had stepped outside again. Her attention was fixed on the same distant terrain she had been studying all day. And for the second time, Ryan found himself wondering why the quiet cook seemed less surprised by unfolding events than anyone else on the base. The next 30 minutes felt longer than the entire day that had come before them. Activity concentrated around the gate as incoming reports painted an increasingly complicated picture. The convoy was moving, but slower than expected. Route conditions had changed. Visibility fluctuated from one valley to the next. Several planned checkpoints had been delayed. Nothing in the reports suggested immediate danger, yet every update seemed to add another layer of uncertainty. Commander Ryan Walker listened carefully to each transmission while comparing notes with his team leaders. Experienced operators understood that uncertainty could be just as challenging as any visible threat. It forced people to make decisions with incomplete information. Around him, Navy SEALs checked equipment, reviewed maps, and monitored communication channels. Nobody wasted words. The base had entered a different phase now. Preparation had replaced routine. Near the perimeter, Tyler Brooks stood with several operators overlooking the western approaches. The jokes from breakfast felt very far away. The mountains beyond the base appeared darker than before, their ridgelines blending into the evening sky. Tyler adjusted a pair of binoculars and scanned the terrain. Everything looked normal. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something important was hidden somewhere in the landscape. A few yards away, Emily Carter stood quietly beside a storage container. She was no longer wearing her kitchen apron. Her sleeves were rolled neatly to her forearms. Her attention remained fixed on the distant terrain. Ryan noticed her again. That alone surprised him. In a base filled with highly trained professionals, he rarely spent time thinking about support personnel. Yet throughout the day, Emily had repeatedly drawn his attention without saying much at all. He walked toward her. "You have been studying those mountains for hours." Emily nodded slightly. "People usually look at what is moving." Ryan folded his arms. "And what do you look at?" Her answer came immediately. "What is not moving?" Ryan glanced toward the ridgeline. "That sounds more like something a reconnaissance specialist would say." Emily offered no response. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Ryan found himself waiting for her to explain, but she simply continued watching the terrain. Then she pointed toward a distant slope nearly 2 miles away. "See that section near the rock formation?" Ryan narrowed his eyes. The distance made details difficult to distinguish. "What about it?" "The dust changed direction there twice today." Ryan looked again. He could not see what she saw. Not from this distance. Yet her certainty was impossible to ignore. Before he could ask another question, a radio operator hurried across the compound carrying fresh information. The convoy had finally established stronger communication. Progress continued, but a route adjustment was now under consideration. Team leaders immediately gathered around updated maps. Ryan turned away to join them. When he looked back a few moments later, Emily had not moved. The same calm focus remained in her eyes. And for the first time all day, Commander Walker began to suspect that the quiet cook understood the terrain better than many people whose jobs depended on studying it. The compound lights flickered on as darkness settled across the valley. Shadows stretched along the barriers and vehicle lanes while personnel continued moving with quiet purpose. Inside the operations center, maps covered every available surface. Updated route information arrived in fragments, forcing analysts to piece together a constantly changing picture. Commander Ryan Walker stood over a large terrain display, studying elevation lines and approach routes. Several experienced operators offered recommendations, each supported by years of field experience. Yet the more information Ryan received, the less certain the situation seemed. The terrain itself appeared to be creating the problem. Every route option introduced new complications. Every adjustment seemed to generate another question. Outside, Emily Carter remained near the perimeter. The wind had strengthened again. Fine dust drifted through the floodlights, creating faint patterns that most people ignored. Emily did not ignore them. Her eyes moved slowly across the ridgeline. One slope, then another, then back again. She appeared less interested in the roads than the mountains surrounding them. Tyler Brooks approached carrying a radio handset. "You are still out here?" Emily nodded. "You are still asking questions?" Tyler smiled despite himself. Over the course of the day, his opinion of her had begun to change. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to replace mockery with curiosity. "Let me ask you something," he said. "What exactly are you looking for?" Emily stared toward the western ridge. "Patterns." Tyler followed her gaze. "That is not much of an answer. Most answers are hidden inside patterns." Tyler laughed softly. "You sound like a professor." Emily did not respond. Before the conversation could continue, another transmission echoed from the operations center. Personnel immediately shifted positions. Team leaders moved toward updated reports. The atmosphere tightened once again. Ryan exited the building carrying a folder and headed toward the gate. His expression revealed little, but everyone around him understood the situation remained unresolved. He noticed Emily standing near the perimeter and walked directly toward her. "You mentioned a rock formation earlier." Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." Ryan pointed toward the mountains. "What made you focus on that specific location?" For the first time all evening, Emily answered without hesitation. "The wind should be crossing the slope from north to south." Ryan glanced toward the ridge. "And it is not." Ryan studied her face. "You can tell that from here?" "Yes." The commander remained silent for several seconds. Operators nearby exchanged puzzled looks. One of them finally said, "Sir, with respect, nobody can calculate that accurately from this distance." Emily turned toward the speaker. Her expression stayed calm. "You do not calculate it. You observe it." The operator opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Something in her confidence made argument feel pointless. Ryan looked back toward the mountains, then back at Emily. Throughout the day, she had noticed details nobody else mentioned. Weather shifts, dust movement, terrain behavior, small observations that somehow connected into a larger picture. For the first time, the commander began wondering whether the quiet woman from the kitchen possessed a level of situational awareness that exceeded anything written inside her personnel file. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, hidden among miles of dark terrain, the answer seemed to be waiting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A communications specialist rushed from the operations center, carrying a fresh set of terrain overlays generated from recent surveillance data. Several team leaders gathered around a portable table while Commander Ryan Walker reviewed the information under a floodlight. The maps revealed elevation changes, rock formations, and natural channels spread across miles of rugged landscape. Operators immediately began discussing route options. Emily Carter remained several feet away, listening quietly. One of the analysts pointed toward a narrow section of terrain. If conditions continue shifting, this becomes the most likely approach corridor. Another disagreed. Too exposed. The convoy would avoid it. The discussion continued. Ryan listened carefully before noticing Emily studying the same map from a distance. She was not looking at the highlighted route. She was focused on a completely different section, a ridgeline nobody else seemed interested in. Something catching your attention? Ryan asked. Several heads turned. Emily stepped closer. For a moment she said nothing. Then she pointed toward a cluster of contour lines near a steep slope. This section does not match the rest of the terrain. One of the operators frowned. It is just a ridge. Emily shook her head. No. Look at the elevation. Changes. The operator crossed his arms. What about them? Emily traced a finger along the map. The slope creates a natural funnel for wind movement. Everything around it follows the same pattern except this area. The group exchanged confused looks. Ryan studied the map more closely. You are saying the terrain behaves differently there? Yes. How do you know? Emily's answer came immediately. Because the dust movement changed every time it passed that position. Silence followed. The operators looked at one another. Most had spent years studying terrain, yet nobody had mentioned that possibility. Ryan narrowed his eyes. You noticed all of that from the base? Emily nodded. The signs were visible if you knew where to look. Tyler Brooks let out a low whistle. Earlier that morning, he had joked about pancakes and kitchen duty. Now he found himself staring at Emily as though meeting her for the first time. Ryan folded the map and looked toward the mountains. Then back at Emily. You keep seeing things everyone else misses. Most people are looking for movement, she replied. I look for changes. Another operator shook his head in disbelief. Where exactly did you learn to read terrain like that? Emily glanced toward the dark ridgeline. For the first time all evening, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. Not in a kitchen. The answer only deepened the mystery. Nobody laughed. Nobody made another joke. The woman they thought they understood no longer fit inside the simple role they had assigned her. Ryan sensed it too. Somewhere beneath the quiet professionalism, beneath the routine kitchen work and the months of anonymity, Emily Carter possessed knowledge that did not belong in a mess hall. And as the wind continued moving across the mountains beyond the gate, everyone standing there began to realize they might have underestimated her from the very beginning. The realization spread slowly through the group. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The floodlights hummed softly overhead while the wind continued moving across the valley. Commander Ryan Walker unfolded the map again and handed it directly to Emily. Show me. The request carried none of the skepticism that had been present earlier. Emily stepped forward and placed the map on the table. Several operators gathered around. Tyler Brooks moved closer as well, no longer trying to hide his curiosity. Emily studied the terrain for a moment before tracing a path across the paper. The convoy is focused on the road. She pointed toward another section. But the terrain is controlling the conditions around the road. One of the analysts frowned. Explain that. Emily nodded. Wind does not move randomly through mountains. Elevation channels it, redirects it, creates predictable patterns. Her finger moved toward the ridgeline she had identified earlier. If this area behaves differently, then something about the environment there is affecting everything around it. Ryan leaned closer. You figured that out by watching dust? Dust, shadows, wind direction, temperature changes. Another operator stared at her. Most people would never notice that. Emily offered a small shrug. Most people are busy looking somewhere else. The statement landed harder than she intended. Several team members exchanged glances. For months they had done exactly that. They had looked past her, past the quiet cook who arrived before sunrise and left long after everyone finished eating. Ryan studied her carefully. Every answer she gave created more questions. Her observations were too precise. Her reasoning too disciplined. None of it matched the image they had built in their minds. Tyler finally spoke. You talk about terrain the same way some people talk about mathematics. Emily looked at him. That is because terrain is mathematics. Tyler blinked. The answer sounded simple, yet nobody immediately challenged it. Ryan noticed something else. Whenever Emily explained a concept, she never tried to impress anyone. There was no arrogance, no performance. She spoke the way experts often did when discussing subjects they understood completely. To her, these observations seemed ordinary. The commander folded his arms. You said earlier that you did not learn this in a kitchen. Emily looked toward the mountains. The faint smile returned. No, sir. Then where? For the first time. All evening, she hesitated. Not because she appeared uncomfortable, because she seemed to be deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she answered. Before I joined the military, I taught applied physics. Several operators stared at her. Tyler nearly laughed from surprise, but stopped himself. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Physics. Emily nodded. Ballistics. Environmental modeling. Predictive systems. Silence followed. The revelation explained far more than anyone expected. Suddenly the weather charts, the terrain observations, the attention to detail all made sense. Yet at the same time, the answer transformed the quiet cook into someone entirely different. Not a mystery anymore. Something more interesting. Someone who understood the world through patterns most people never even noticed. And as everyone stood beneath the floodlights listening to her speak, the mountains beyond the gate no longer seemed like the only thing they had misunderstood. The tension that had dominated the evening slowly gave way to something else. Respect. Not the kind that came from rank or authority, but the kind earned when assumptions collapsed under the weight of reality. Around the map table, nobody was looking at Emily Carter the same way anymore. The quiet cook they had overlooked for months had revealed a level of expertise that none of them expected. Yet what impressed Commander Ryan Walker most was not her knowledge. It was her humility. Emily never once acted as though she had proven anyone wrong. She never reminded people of their jokes. She never demanded recognition. She simply answered questions and focused on the problem in front of them. Another update arrived from the convoy. Conditions along the route had improved. Communication quality was stabilizing. The information gathered throughout the evening was helping commanders make better decisions. The atmosphere across the base gradually relaxed. Operators returned to their assignments. Radios became less frantic. Conversations resumed. Ryan remained near the perimeter studying the mountains one last time before turning toward Emily. You could have told people about your background. Emily smiled faintly. Nobody asked. Ryan laughed quietly. It was such a simple answer, yet it explained everything. People had seen an apron and stopped looking. They had assumed they understood her before ever learning who she was. Tyler Brooks approached, looking more uncomfortable than he had all day. I owe you an apology. Emily looked at him. For what? Tyler rubbed the back of his neck. The jokes. The comments. All of it. Emily considered his words for a moment. You were not really talking about me. Tyler frowned. What does that mean? You were talking about the person you thought I was. The answer left him speechless. Nearby operators exchanged thoughtful glances. Ryan noticed the effect her words had on everyone standing there. Emily was not angry. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She was simply stating a truth most people rarely considered. The assumptions people make often reveal more about themselves than the person they are judging. A cool breeze swept across the compound. For the first time all day, Emily looked tired. Ryan noticed it immediately. You have probably been awake since before sunrise. For 30, she replied. And you are still standing here solving problems for my team. Emily shrugged. The food is already prepared for tomorrow. Several operators laughed. The sound felt different now. Warmer. Genuine. As the group slowly dispersed, Ryan remained near the gate watching the mountains fade into darkness. The events of the day replayed in his mind. Not because of a mission, not because of a report, because of a lesson. Expertise does not always arrive wearing the uniform people expect. Talent does not announce itself. Wisdom rarely demands attention. Sometimes it works quietly in a kitchen long before anyone notices it. Before leaving, Ryan looked toward Emily one final time. She was already heading back toward the mess hall, preparing for another early morning while everyone else headed for rest. The commander shook his head and smiled. Months earlier, people saw a cook. Tonight, they saw something much more important. A professional. And in the end, everyone on that base learned the same lesson. Respect is earned through character, competence, and action, never through appearances alone.